I was only supposed to observe a simple exchange, but when the old man revealed a government seal in a room full of executioners, I realized I'd just stepped into a shadow war I was never meant to survive. My badge was my only protection, and by the time the first shot shattered my windshield, I knew I had already been marked as the next target to be erased. The rain in this city doesn't wash anything away. It just pushes the grime into the cracks of the sidewalk. I was sitting in my unmarked sedan, parked 3 blocks down from the abandoned warehouse district, nursing a lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. I wasn't supposed to be here. Technically, I was on mandatory leave after the department decided my methods were unorthodox, which is just bureaucratic shorthand for too effective. I watched the gray structure through binoculars. My contact, a nervous snitch who had seen enough to know he was already dead, had tipped me off about a late-night meet. He said the group was moving something big. Not just the usual petty theft or street-level hustling, but something that reached into the pockets of the people in power. I wasn't looking to make an arrest. I was looking for the missing piece of a puzzle that had cost my partner his life 2 years ago. That's when the headlights cut through the gloom. It wasn't a van or a blacked-out SUV. It was a patrol cruiser, a local precinct unit, rolling way off their beat. I adjusted my position, feeling the familiar weight of the holstered gear against my ribs. Something was off. You don't see marked cars hovering near a known drop point for an organized scheme unless someone is on the take, or someone is about to play hero. The cruiser pulled up to the curb, cutting its lights. 2 officers stepped out. They were young, the kind of fresh recruits who still thought the badge made them bulletproof. They weren't there to investigate, they were there to intimidate. They walked toward the warehouse entrance, but stopped dead when a figure emerged from the side alley. It was an old man. He looked like he'd been dragged through a hedge backward. Tattered coat, hunched shoulders, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. He didn't look like a kingpin. He looked like a grandfather who had taken a wrong turn on his way to the bus stop. One of the officers, a tall guy with a jawline that could cut glass, barked something at the senior. The old man didn't move. He just stood there, his head bowed, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. The officer stepped forward, shoving the old man in the chest. It was a brutal, unnecessary shove that sent the elderly man stumbling back into the damp brick wall. The sound of the impact echoed off the empty warehouses like a gunshot. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart hammering against my chest. I knew I should stay put. I was off the clock, under investigation, and my badge was effectively a paperweight. But watching them kick the old man's cane away, watching them laugh as he struggled to maintain his balance, something in me snapped. Then it happened. The old man stopped trembling. His posture shifted, his shoulders squaring in a way that didn't match his age. He reached into his coat, not for a wallet, but for a burner phone. He didn't scream for help. He didn't beg. He tapped the screen once, his eyes locking onto the patrol car's dash cam, and a cold, slow smile spread across his face. "You boys really shouldn't have done that," he whispered. The sound didn't carry to me, but I could read his lips perfectly. Within seconds, the silence of the night was shattered by the arrival of 3 black SUVs, sliding into the intersection from every direction. They didn't have sirens. They didn't have markings. The doors flew open simultaneously, and men in charcoal gray tactical gear poured out. They didn't move like patrol officers. They moved with the precision of a surgical strike. The 2 officers, realizing they had walked into a trap, scrambled for their holsters, but they were pinned by red laser dots dancing across their chests. The lead officer froze, his hands trembling as he stared at the men surrounding him. The old man, meanwhile, stood tall, his eyes burning with a terrifying authority. He pointed a thin, scarred finger at the officers. That's when I saw it. Tucked beneath the old man's coat, hidden by the shadows, was a document folder sealed with a red wax stamp I hadn't seen since the state capitol building. He wasn't a victim. He was a courier, and those 2 idiot cops had just intercepted the most dangerous delivery in the city. One of the tactical men walked toward the patrol officers, pulling a silencer from his vest. I realized then that this wasn't an arrest. It was a cleanup crew. The cops weren't being booked. They were being erased. I reached for my radio, but it was dead. jammed by a high-frequency signal. I had one shot to intervene, one chance to keep those two kids alive. But as I kicked my engine to life, the old man turned his gaze directly toward my car. He hadn't been looking at the cops. He had been looking at me the entire time. He nodded to the tactical team, and suddenly every light on the street went black. Darkness swallowed the scene, and I realized with a sinking dread that I hadn't just watched a crime. I had been marked as a witness. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating veil that made the rain feel like cold needles against my windshield. I didn't think. I reacted. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt as I desperately tried to create distance. My heart was a frantic drum in my ears. I wasn't just watching a routine patrol gone wrong. I was watching a professional execution, and I was the only person left alive who could talk about it. Behind me, the warehouse district was a graveyard of shadows. I could hear the muffled thud of footsteps on gravel, not the frantic running of panicked cops, but the rhythmic synchronized march of people who knew exactly where I was. How? I had kept my engine off, my lights dimmed, and my phone in a Faraday bag. Unless they had thermal, or unless I had been compromised from the moment I arrived. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The snitch. He hadn't been an informant. He had been bait. I swung the sedan around a corner, the rear end fishtailing before I regained control. My headlights swept across a brick wall, illuminating a rusted "No Trespassing" sign, just as the back window of my car shattered into a million tiny diamonds. Glass sprayed the interior, dusting my neck and shoulders. Someone was firing with precision, not spray and pray. They were aiming for the driver's seat. I floored the accelerator, weaving through the labyrinthine alleys of the industrial sector. Every turn felt like a gamble. My side mirror was gone, hanging by a thread of plastic, but I could see the silhouette of a black SUV glued to my bumper. Their headlights were off, relying on advanced night vision technology. It was like playing tag with a ghost. I remembered the old man's face, that calm, chilling smile. He wasn't just a courier, he was an architect. And if he had the power to call in a tactical cleanup crew within seconds, he was high up in the organized scheme that ran this city. My mind raced back to the document folder. The red wax seal. It wasn't just government correspondence. It was a death warrant for anyone who saw what was inside. A sudden, sharp pain flared in my side. A glancing blow from a ricochet. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the warmth of blood soaking through my jacket. I had to ditch the car. I spun the wheel hard, ducking into a narrow alley between two crumbling textile mills. The gap was barely wider than the sedan, and I heard the screech of metal on brick as I scraped both sides of the vehicle, effectively wedging it tight. I killed the ignition and rolled out the passenger door before the car stopped rocking. I scrambled up a rusted fire escape, my lungs burning, my vision blurring at the edges. I reached the roof, huffing for breath, and crawled toward the edge to look down. Below, the SUV skidded to a halt. 3 figures emerged, moving with silent efficiency. They approached my car, weapons raised, scanning the interior. One of them checked the driver's seat and gestured to the others. They knew I had escaped on foot. I wasn't safe. I wasn't even close. I stood up, shaking the glass from my hair, and turned to head toward the neighboring building. That's when the beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the fog, pinning me against the chimney stack. I froze, blinded by the glare. "You're a hard man to kill, detective," a voice boomed. Not from behind the flashlight, but from a speaker mounted on a drone, hovering silently just 10 feet to my left. I squinted, trying to see the person holding the light. It was the old man. He had climbed the fire escape with an agility that defied his hunched posture. He stood on the edge of the roof, perfectly balanced, his cane replaced by a sleek, suppressed piece of illegal hardware. "The department thinks you're a loose cannon," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of malice. "They won't even look for you when you don't show up for work tomorrow. They'll just assume you finally took the payout and left town." He took a step forward, the tactical team now swarming the roof behind him. I backed away, my heels hovering over the precipice of the building. Below was a 30-foot drop into a trash-filled alley. Behind me was an abyss. In front of me was a firing squad. "Hand over the recording," he demanded, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know you were filming from your dash cam. Give it to me, and you might get to keep your life." I reached into my pocket, but I didn't pull out a phone. I pulled out a flare gun, the only thing I'd been able to grab from my glove box before I bailed. I pointed it not at him, but at the gas main pipe running along the side of the building. The old man's eyes widened just for a fraction of a second. "Do you want to see who's really in charge?" I shouted, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Because I think we're about to find out." I fired. The flare whistled through the damp air, striking the pipe and sparking an immediate, violent jet of flame. The explosion wasn't big, but it was enough to send a sheet of fire rushing up the side of the building, forcing the men back. As the roof began to collapse under the heat, I didn't jump into the alley. I lunged toward the old man, desperate to take him down with me. But as I collided with him, he didn't stumble. He caught me by the throat with a grip like a vice, his face inches from mine. "You fool," he hissed, his eyes turning cold and dead. "You have no idea what you just ignited." Suddenly, the ground beneath us didn't just vibrate, it dropped. The entire section of the roof gave way, and as we plummeted into the darkness of the burning warehouse, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The old man wasn't wearing a wire, he was wearing a service badge from the Internal Affairs Department of the agency that was supposed to be investigating him. He wasn't the enemy's boss. He was the internal mole, and he had just trapped me in his own private slaughterhouse. The sensation of falling lasted an eternity. We hit the floorboards of the warehouse's upper level with a bone-jarring thud, the impact knocking the air from my lungs and sending stars exploding across my vision. Dust, thick and suffocating, billowed around us like a gray shroud. I scrambled backward, coughing, clutching my bruised ribs as I tried to regain my bearings. Through the holes in the shattered floor, I could see the flames licking at the steel support beams, casting long, dancing shadows that made the room look like a purgatory of jagged metal and rotting wood. The old man had recovered faster than any human his age should have. He was on his feet, dusting off his coat with a nonchalant flick of his wrist. His cane, which I now realized was a cleverly disguised baton, was back in his hand. He didn't look injured. He looked annoyed. "That was a drastic move, Detective," he said, his voice echoing in the vast hollow space. "And incredibly short-sighted. You've just destroyed the only evidence that could have exonerated you while simultaneously signing your own death warrant." I scrambled to my feet, my back hitting a rusted pillar. "You're with them," I wheezed, pointing to the badge clipped to his inner pocket, a badge that belonged to the very agency tasked with rooting out corruption. "You're not investigating the organized scheme. You are the organized scheme. You're the one running the internal leaks." He laughed, a dry, rasping sound that had no humor in it. "Labels are for the common folk, Detective. We call it maintaining the equilibrium. The city requires a certain amount of friction. If the internal security doesn't control the flow, the whole infrastructure collapses. We keep the streets predictable. You, however, are a variable we never accounted for." He signaled to the shadows behind him. 3 more men emerged from the gloom, weapons drawn. These weren't the standard tactical team from before. These were cleaners. Their uniforms were devoid of any patches or identifiers, and they moved with a predatory, silent grace that made the hair on my arms stand up. They weren't here to capture me. They were here to ensure I never left this warehouse. I looked around for an exit, but the fire was closing in, creating a wall of heat that drove us further into the corner of the building. The smoke was getting heavier, tasting of chemicals and burnt plastic. I realized then that the warehouse wasn't just a meeting spot. It was a front for a laboratory, and it was currently burning through a stockpile of volatile materials. "Why me?" I shouted over the roar of the fire. "Why go to such lengths for a washed-up detective?" The old man took a slow step toward me, his shadow stretching across the floor. "Because, Detective, you weren't just investigating a crime. You were looking into the transfer of those packages of forbidden substances that were intercepted last week. You found the connection between the warehouse and the higher-ups, and you were just about to hand that information over to someone who wouldn't be as easily bought as your precinct captain." I felt my hand brush against something cold and hard on the floor, a heavy iron wrench left behind by a long-gone worker. I curled my fingers around it, my heart racing. I had one chance. "You think you've won," I said, trying to steady my voice. "But you're wrong. I didn't keep that dash cam footage on my phone. I synced it to the cloud. The moment I lost signal, it triggered an upload to every major news outlet in the state." The old man paused. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine hesitation in his eyes. He stopped walking, his gaze darting toward the cleaners. "You're lying." "Check your tablet," I taunted, pointing at the device held by the lead cleaner. "The notification should be hitting their servers right about now." The cleaner looked down at his screen, his face turning pale in the flickering firelight. He held it up for the old man to see. Whatever was on that screen, it wasn't the footage. It was a massive, system-wide lockdown command. I hadn't uploaded the video. I had triggered a remote wipe of the entire local network, including their internal communications and their encrypted databases. I had effectively blinded them. Chaos erupted. The cleaners broke their formation, frantically trying to regain control of their devices. The old man screamed at them, his facade of calm completely shattered. This was my moment. I lunged, not for the door, but for the main circuit breaker box mounted on the wall behind the old man. I swung the iron wrench with every ounce of strength I had left. The metal box shattered, a shower of sparks raining down on us as I severed the main line. The entire building plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. In the ensuing panic, I didn't try to run. I dove to the floor, rolling behind a stack of crates. Gunfire erupted in the dark, frantic and blind, as the cleaners turned their weapons on each other in the confusion. The old man was shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of bullets tearing through wood and metal. I crawled through the debris, my hands raw and bleeding, heading toward what I hoped was an emergency ventilation shaft I had spotted on the blueprints months ago. I reached the small opening and kicked the grate off, scrambling inside. As I pulled myself into the narrow tunnel, a stray bullet pinged off the wall inches from my ear. I scrambled forward, the heat becoming unbearable. I reached the end of the shaft and kicked out the outer covering, spilling out onto the wet alleyway pavement outside. I took a deep breath of the cool, rain-soaked air, relief washing over me. I was out. I was alive. But as I stood up, my relief vanished. A black vehicle was idling at the end of the alley. The back door opened, and a woman I recognized instantly from the department's most wanted files, a woman who was supposed to be in a high-security prison, stepped out, holding a phone to her ear. She looked at me, a cruel, knowing smirk on her face. "You made a big mess, detective," she said, nodding to the men stepping out of the car behind her. "But don't worry. The cleanup crew is here." The woman's smirk was sharp enough to draw blood. She stood under the flickering neon sign of a nearby dive bar, the rain slicking her hair back against her scalp. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered her prey after months of watching from the shadows. The men trailing her, 3 of them wearing long trench coats that concealed what I knew to be heavy-duty equipment, didn't move with the frantic energy of the warehouse guards. They moved with the terrifying, patient deliberation of a firing squad. I didn't waste my breath on pleas. I turned and bolted. My boots slapped against the wet asphalt as I sprinted into the labyrinth of the service alley. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of doors slamming and the distinct metallic clack of weapons being prepared. "Don't kill him yet," the woman shouted, her voice cutting through the downpour like a razor. "He still has the codes for the server unlock. Find him." I ducked behind a stack of overflowing industrial dumpsters, my breath coming in jagged, painful gasps. My side was still bleeding, a dull, throbbing ache that was rapidly sapping my strength. I looked down at my jacket. I was losing too much blood. If I didn't get help soon, I'd pass out right here in the mud. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the encrypted drive I'd managed to rip from the terminal inside the warehouse before the floor collapsed. The drive was warm. It contained every transaction, every name, and every contact for the entire organized scheme. If I could get this to the right person, not the corrupt brass, not the compromised precinct, but the federal investigators who were still operating under the radar, this whole rotten house of cards would come tumbling down. I heard footsteps approaching from both ends of the alley. They were closing the pincer. I was trapped. I looked up at the wall of a fire suppression unit, a massive steel box bolted to the side of the building. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled desperation, I jammed my hands into the gaps of the brickwork and hauled myself up. My fingers were raw, the skin tearing on the rough masonry, but I didn't stop. I pulled myself onto the narrow ledge of the building's drainage system and shimmied along the wall, praying the metal wouldn't buckle under my weight. Below me, the cleaners reached the dumpsters. I saw them fan out, their flashlights dancing across the empty space where I had been seconds ago. "He's gone," one of them growled, his voice distorted by a radio headset. "He couldn't have gone far," the woman snapped back. "He's injured. Search the roofs. If you find him, take him alive, but don't hesitate to cripple him if he resists." I held my breath, pressing my face against the cold brick. I was directly above them now, dangling by my fingertips from a rusted rain gutter. The wind whipped around the building, masking the sound of my ragged breathing. I saw the lead cleaner look up, his gaze sweeping the wall. I froze. He stopped, his flashlight beam creeping inch by inch toward my position. My grip was failing. My fingers were slick with rain and blood. I felt my hand start to slide. Just one more second, I prayed. Just let them turn away. But they didn't. The beam landed right on my boots. The man yelled, and instantly the alley erupted in a cacophony of shouting and the rhythmic thud of boots hitting the fire escape. I didn't wait for them to reach me. I threw myself across the gap to the next building, landing hard on the gravel-covered roof. I rolled, tucking my head, and scrambled toward the far edge. I didn't realize until it was too late that I had run into a dead end. The building I was on was lower than the others, and the drop to the street below was a sheer 100-foot plummet. I spun around, back to the ledge, looking for a way out. The door to the roof access was already being kicked in by the cleaners. I backed up until my heels touched the very edge of the roof. The woman walked out onto the rooftop, stepping over the debris. She looked at me, her expression one of bored amusement. She pulled a silenced weapon from her coat, aiming it steadily at my knee. "You've been a massive inconvenience, detective," she said, "but you're out of road. Give me the drive and you might get a clean end. Refuse and I'll ensure you spend your final moments wishing you'd never taken this case." I held the drive up, the small metal casing glinting in the pale moonlight. "You want this? Come and get it." I took a step back, my balance faltering over the ledge. The woman's eyes widened, her weapon arm twitching. "Don't you dare!" "I'm not dying for you," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm dying for the truth." I leaned back, feeling the sickening sensation of weightlessness as I tipped over the edge, but as I fell, I felt a hand, strong, calloused, and surprisingly firm, grab my jacket. I was jerked to a violent halt, dangling in midair above the abyss, held by a man who had appeared from the darkness of the fire escape. He hauled me back up, pulling me onto the roof, but he didn't hand me over to the woman. He leaned close to my ear, his breath smelling of stale tobacco, and whispered, "I've been waiting for you to do that for 20 years. He held up a badge that looked identical to the one the old man had worn, but with a different seal, and shoved me behind him, aiming his own weapon at the woman. "The Internal Service is here, and you're under arrest for an attempt to commit a crime involving a state-sanctioned operation." The woman froze, her gun dropping. I looked at my savior, my vision blurring, and realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't here to save me. He was wearing the same insignia as the rest of them. He was just a different faction of the same nightmare. The silence on the roof was heavy, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic thrum of the city and the harsh, ragged sound of my own breathing. The man holding me by the collar, the one who had just claimed to be the Internal Service, stared down the woman with a look of cold, predatory hunger. The cleaners who had been chasing me stood frozen, their weapons half raised, caught in the middle of a power struggle they didn't understand. "You're late," the woman spat, her voice tight. The directive was clear. "Neutralize the variable and recover the drive. You aren't supposed to be here, Marcus." "The directive changed," the man named Marcus replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't look at me, but his grip on my jacket remained agonizingly tight. "The department decided your method of maintaining equilibrium had become a liability. You've drawn too much heat. The footage that idiot detective supposedly leaked? It's real. It's circulating through the secure lines of the Regional Oversight Committee right now. You're done. My head swam. I realized then that I wasn't just a witness. I was a pawn in a shadow war between two competing branches of the same corrupt entity. One side wanted to keep the status quo. The other wanted to purge the evidence and start fresh with a new group of pawns. Neither side cared about the law. Neither side cared about me. I gripped the drive in my hand, my knuckles white. I had one last move. I didn't try to pull away. Instead, I let my body go limp, feigning a faint. As I slumped toward the gravel, I slammed the drive onto the surface of the roof, right next to an open drainage grate that led to a sewer outflow. A drop that would carry it deep into the city's sublevels, well beyond their reach. Marcus saw it happen. His eyes darted to the drive, then back to the woman. In that microsecond of distraction, his grip loosened. I kicked out with everything I had left, my boot connecting solidly with his kneecap. He howled, stumbling back, and the roof erupted into chaos. The cleaners didn't know who to shoot. The woman opened fire on Marcus, and the rooftop turned into a storm of lead. I didn't wait to see who won. I scrambled toward the edge, grabbing the drive from the grating just before it vanished down the hole. I didn't go over the side. I dived toward the service stairs, rolling down the metal steps, bruising every bone in my body as I descended toward the back alley. I hit the pavement running, ignoring the burning in my side. I knew exactly where I had to go. I didn't head for the precinct, and I didn't head for home. I headed for the public library 3 blocks away, a building that served as the local satellite office for the state's Independent Audit Bureau, the only office in the city without a direct line to the agency that had spent the night trying to kill me. I sprinted through the rain, the sound of sirens finally piercing the air, not the sirens of the corrupt precinct, but the high-pitched, insistent wail of the state police. I crashed through the glass doors of the lobby, breathless and bleeding, and slammed the drive onto the receptionist's desk. "Call the regional director," I gasped, clutching the counter to keep from falling. "Tell them I have the evidence. Tell them I'm the witness from the warehouse incident." The receptionist, a terrified young woman, didn't argue. She stared at my blood-stained jacket and the frantic look in my eyes, then picked up the phone. Within minutes, the building was swarming with agents, not the ones in charcoal gray tactical gear, but suit-wearing bureaucrats with expressions of grim, absolute resolve. I watched from a chair as they took the drive, their faces shifting from skepticism to cold, hard shock as they scanned the contents. They hadn't just found a list of crimes. They had found a blueprint for a decade of systemic rot that went straight to the top of the department. The resolution didn't happen in a blaze of glory. It happened in sterile boardrooms and quiet, heavily guarded interrogation cells. I spent the next 3 days giving statements, my voice rasping from the smoke and exhaustion. I told them everything. The snitch, the old man, the internal mole, and the woman who had tried to erase me. A week later, I sat in a small windowless office, drinking coffee that finally didn't taste like ash. The lead auditor leaned across the table, a grim smile on his face. "You did it, detective," he said, pushing a thick manila folder toward me. "The warrants are signed. The arrests began an hour ago. Every name on that drive is being picked up. You've dismantled a machine that's been grinding the city into dust for 20 years. I looked at the folder, but I didn't open it. I felt empty, yet strangely at peace. The department would never be the same. The city would never be the same. The old man, the woman, and their entire network were gone, pulled out by the roots. "What about me?" I asked, leaning back. "My career. My life." "You're a hero, officially," he replied. "Unofficially, you're a man who knows too much. We suggest you take the early retirement package. Move somewhere quiet. Somewhere where the rain doesn't feel like it's trying to kill you." I walked out of the bureau and into the bright, sharp sunlight of a new day. I didn't look back at the precinct. I didn't look for my car. I walked toward the train station, the weight of the badge finally gone from my coat, replaced by the simple, heavy realization that for the first time in a decade, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. The fatal mistake hadn't been the cops attacking the senior. It had been thinking that a man like me would ever be silenced. I stepped onto the train, watched the city skyline recede into the distance, and for the first time in my life, I truly smiled. The storm was over, and I was still standing.